Ladies and gentlemen, hello again. Welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name is Graham, this is X-Plane 11 and flying the Rotate MD-80. This is part 2 of the flight. In part 1 we took off from Riga in Latvia, got at a cruising altitude of flight level 320. We're just crossing over the Baltic at the moment and the aircraft's in the cruise configuration. It's about 45 miles until top descent, 42 miles. It's a very short cruise segment on this flight. So with that in mind, we'll set the aircraft up for the arrival. Normally, an approach briefing between two crew would be quite an interactive process, making sure we're running the same charts, we've got the same plan of action in mind. As we're operating single pilot in the sim, we can use a much simpler form of briefing. On the speed card guides that I'll put a link to in the video description, there's a kind of helpful guide onto how to brief a single pilot approach. We'll do it from the FMC here. So it's going to be an ILS approach onto runway 26, Stockholm, Arlanda. Minimum safe altitude from the chart is around about 2,500 feet. For the ILS, the decision altitude is 330 feet. RVRs, runway visual range, 550 meters required. The approach aid, it's ILS 110.1, we can tune that just now. 110.1. Front course is 251. And we'll tune it on this side as well. 110.1. And 251. For the missed approach, it will be climbing straight ahead to 1500 feet. That's all on the approach chart. The purpose in this flight is not to look at decoding the approach chart, but rather to look at how to fly the aircraft. The approach is reasonably straightforward, being an ILS. We're going to land at flap 40. So the aircraft calculates it's going to be 127. If we look at the speed cards, flap 40, so we're currently going to use the 54-ton card. Flat 40, VREF is down here 129. There's a couple of knots difference in it. That's just how these are calculated on these speed cards. I'm going to put a 5-knot wind correction in and execute it. That gives me a final approach speed of 133 knots. Importantly, as far as the speeds go, clean speed is 220. I can go all the way down to 220 clean. Once I select the slats, I can go down to 170 knots. That's all I need to know because I'm going to fly the initial approach at 180 knots. So I don't need any flap to fly the start of the approach, although I'll probably use it to increase the drag on the aircraft. Check on the overhead here, we need to set the landing elevation, it's 140 feet. And we need to decide on the braking action we're going to use as well. I'll select auto brake medium and we'll arm the auto brakes once we've got the final landing config. Maintaining flight level 320 and we're still in VNav level with FMS mark. Top descent's coming up shortly. An easy way to come unstuck relying on a VNav arrival is not to look at the altitudes and the speeds the aircraft is intending to fly. You see here it's got Sierra Alpha 493, 240 knots above 5,000 feet, and then only 10 miles away we've got the ILS. ESSA 75 is the start of the ILS approach. 240 knots is a bit excessive to start an ILS at. We'll try 200 knots. And coming back to that 5,000 feet point, we've got 10 miles. Yep, that should be fine. Around about 240 knots at 5,000 feet. That's going to work. Now obviously if we fly the approach in VNav and then we get any track shortening from air traffic, we're going to be a little bit high on the profile. The VNav will fly the steepest possible profile down towards the runway because that's the most efficient way to do it. So we've just got to be aware of track shortening. One of the ways we can guard against it at Arlanda is there's actually a VOR on the field. Frequency's 116.0. If I tune that, we should get a distance to the airfield, and then we'll just use the 3 times table. Just approaching the top of descent, so work on the basis air traffic's cleared us down to flight level 200 when ready. So I select 200, pull the knob, and we've got 200 in blue in amber, sorry. It's maintaining VNav level at the moment. This way it'll descend all by itself. So yeah, about 6 miles before the top of descent, just double check that everything's set correctly in the overhead. Landing elevation's in. Nothing else is required at this point, and we'll set the transponder to below, and engine sync is not required. I only have a single throttle on my joystick, so we don't really actually need the engine sync. This is the second time I've recorded this video. The first time I recorded it, I had lots of issues with the OBS software that I used to record. It was very laggy, lots of frame drops going on. I think I know what's caused it, so hopefully this video will be a lot better. But if you see anything out of position on the overhead panel compared to part 1 of the video series, it's because I had to basically start again and try and match everything up. Hopefully it's not too different. So there we go, top of descent. It's in VNav DES now, and on the rotate model, as soon as the descent starts, it sets the speed bugs up there. So we'll just spend a second or so verifying that what we have got on the bugs is what we expected. 133 is the flap 40 speed, 137 is the flaps 28 speed, and that will be the flap 15 speed for the missed approach. Aircraft's calculated 218 is the clean speed, and the speed card said 220, so that's fine. Because we're going to be acting as our own air traffic controller as well, one of the things I'll use is the heading indicator here, which controls the little dotted green line. Obviously, flying for real, you'd keep that synchronized with the current track, but what I'm going to do is set it to 285. That's about a 34 degree intercept onto the ILS course there. I don't want to intercept to any more than 30 odd degrees, so that green line would give me an indication as to when it's appropriate to take an air traffic vector towards the ESSA 75 point. I mentioned the 3 times table as well. Passing through, well, 1,000 feet below 3,000, let's call it 3,000. 3 times that's 90 miles, plus 10 to slow down would be 100 miles. We've got 93 at the moment, so it's a little bit tight on the profile. But we're not flying directly to the airfield, we're flying across and then down a little bit. So we'll just keep an eye on this. This is a good reference as to how the energy state's going. We'll use VNav down to about flight level 150, and then we'll intervene and use the appropriate managed modes, the appropriate selected modes to fly the final part of the approach. Here's the opportunity to review what we're going to do. So in the descent, I'll put it back to the climb rating mode in case we need that. Transponder already set below, engine syncs off. The cabin pressurization, just to check, we do have a descent right on the cabin. That makes sense. Put the seatbelt signs on, no later than 10,000 feet above the field, and the lights on as required. On the approach, we'll have the ignition on, and we'll make sure the auxiliary hydraulic pump, the aux pump, and the transfer pump are both on prior to using any flaps or slats. We can't, on the MD-80, use the speed brake when we are configured with flaps or slats deployed. It's one or the other. So we need to make sure the speed brake is stowed and disarmed prior to using flaps and slats. So another sensible check would be around 20,000 feet. We'd need 60 miles plus 10, 70 miles. That would be about 85 at 25,000. We've got 82. So it's getting there. We're still a bit tight on the profile, as I said before. Hopefully at this point we'll be cleared down to another level by air traffic, so we'll go down to flight level 80 now. Seeing the constraints, we've got flight level 80 or above at the Sierra Alpha 494, and then 5,000 or above at the 493. Let's zoom the navigation display in just a little bit. So the 494 is only a couple of miles after Zillin, which is the waypoint here. I've set 8,000 in the window, and conveniently 8,000 is the constraint we've got here. So that green indicator says it's going to be okay. It's showing a little bit before the waypoint, and that's because we need to come back to 250 knots at flight level 100. The aircraft's actually planning on 240. So I mentioned that I was having some problems with the recording software. It actually turns out that it was to do with the graphics drivers. I hadn't changed the graphics drivers for months and months, but for whatever reason OBS wasn't recognizing my graphics drivers as being DirectX 10 capable, and as a result we were using software rendering rather than hardware capture, and that was slowing things down an awful lot. So hopefully it's looking a lot better now. So if you've got the Rotate MD-80 and you're enjoying flying it, and you've got any ideas as to what sort of other content you'd like to see with the aircraft, please let me know, because I'm very happy to try and record some additional content for this aircraft. When I set up the Reflected Reality Simulations channel, I made a conscious decision not to just do sort of come fly with me kind of videos where we just fly the same profile over and over and over again. I want to try and make each video an opportunity to learn something different that we haven't seen before, either with the aircraft or as far as flying approach procedures go. So if there's anything you've not seen on the channel that you would like to see, just leave a note in the comments and I'll have a look at it, do the best I can with it. So 18,000 feet, that would be 54 miles, plus 10, 64. So we're getting there, it's getting a little bit closer to the optimal profile just now. Still flying in VNav descent, obviously. What would happen if air traffic gave us a direct Sierra Alpha 493? First thing we need to be aware is 10 miles before the 493 we've still got flight level 80. So let's put that direct to Sierra Alpha 493, and it's going to cut the corner a little bit. Execute. Notice the VNav pointer stays roughly where it is, but in actual fact I think would be a little bit higher than is desired now. Aircraft's calculating, 61 miles down to the 5,000 feet point. 63 miles to the airfield. That's still doable. And it's actually reduced the rate for some reason. I don't really want it to do that. It's trying to make a constraint in here. And this is where VNav gets horribly confusing. I want to tell it that it will still be 240 knots, but if I do that it'll select 240 knots as the current speed. So the way to fix it is we'll just click it onto IS hold, and I'll bring the thrust levers back to idle. Then I'll tell the aircraft I want to fly the descent at 270 knots, and it will lower the nose and fly with that idle thrust. That's not unique to flight sim. The VNav system, it's all good in theory, but in practice, once you get onto air traffic, change your flight path, it starts to be a lot more work trying to understand what the VNav is doing than just simply using the 3 times table. We can see here at 15,000 feet, that'd be 45 miles. We've got still a little bit of energy to lose. We need to make about 5 miles on the profile. But we could actually do it from here. We've got a sensible DME from the ILS now as well, so I can change over from Arlanda back to the ILS. The other thing we can do through 15,000 feet, so we don't forget, is put the seatbelt signs on. So interestingly, the auto thrust, it's got the upper limit mode here that will advance the thrust levers to the rated setting. It doesn't have a button you can push to bring it back to idle. Obviously on the Boeing, level change would do that. Level change would accelerate the engine's decline thrust. If you're going uphill, bring it back to idle if you're going downhill. But to get it back to idle, there's nothing in the auto thrust column, auto throttle column, and I've just moved the levers back to the idle detent. Hopefully by this point, cleared further down. What we'll do is, rather than mess around being air traffic, I'll set 2,500. That's the platform altitude for the approach. So 2,500 in amber. If I was flying this airplane, I would probably spend a couple of minutes in the cruise cleaning all this dust off the display. I can understand why the developers have chosen to put that on there. It just adds a little bit of gritty detail, if you like. But you know, we are able to clean these things in the cruise. We've got little wipes to clean them off to make sure you can actually see the displays. I wouldn't ever fly it in this kind of condition. So what I want to do is just decelerate back to 250 knots. Obviously speed is being controlled by the pitch channel at the moment, so I'll set 250. It'll raise the nose, slows back down to 250, and then descend again. You can see we're still a little bit tight on the profile, so what I'll do is once we're back at 250, I'll select just a little bit of speed brake, go to the half setting. Again, it makes sense if you intervene early on the speed brake. You know, if you're trying to make adjustments in the last few thousand feet of the approach, it's probably a little bit late to be messing around with that. As we go below flight level 100, it will lose the ground speed indication as well. I don't understand why McDonnell Douglas would do that. It would be better to have the ground speed all the way through the flight profile. I guess there's a good reason for it, but it's not immediately obvious at the moment. It makes doing non-precision work in the MD-80 really quite difficult because the ground speed is one of the really useful things to have for non-precision. So 10,000 feet, 32 miles. It's looking quite tight still. And that was with a nominal VNav descent point. Put the landing lights on. Obviously with it using scroll manipulators as well, you've got to be careful if you're zooming and moving the mouse around because it inadvertently picked up the alternate static source there. It's back to normal. ESSA 7.5 is my final approach platform. We should be level just before it. I think we're going to need the speed brakes all the way down here. So at 8,000 feet, we'd need 24 miles. We're going to have in the region of 27.5. I mentioned in the first video the GPWS glide slope caution is incredibly sensitive. That's part of the the built-in X-Plane GPWS. I really don't like it. It should desensitize itself as you get closer to the runway, and it doesn't. So you get lots of spurious glide slope cautions with this aircraft, and any aircraft that uses the default X-Plane logic. Click that button there, it inhibits the glide slope caution. There's nothing really more annoying than getting to 50 feet and having it call glide slope at you when you're flying the aircraft visually. And that's why the system in real life desensitizes itself. So at this point here, air traffic could give us a vector towards the localizer, but given the profile, I'd probably turn that down, just fly the extra few track miles to help us get the height off. The situation is improving, 6,000 feet, that's pretty good. 18 miles we need, and we're going to have about 23, so we've got 5 miles spare to slow down. Remember the gate I mentioned all the way back in the descent planning ground school video of 5,000 feet, 20 miles and 250 knots? That's still a little bit hot in the MD-80. So we don't want to go below 5,000 feet until we pass the Sierra Alpha 493. What I'll do is I'll use the opportunity to bring the speed off. What I do as well is we'll transition over to speed and vertical speed. So I'll do selected speed and go vertical speed on here, and then we'll fly the rest of the approach speed VS. Still got the speed brakes out as well. So 220 is minimum clean, turning at the 493, I'll increase the rate of descent now. ESSA 75 is the point I want to be level at, and on the MD-80 it's got lots of drag available should we need it. So what I'll do is I'll just keep coming down. On that track there we should be cleared to intercept the ILS. Just bring the heading bug there, click ILS, and we've got a lock track. It's actually going to maneuver for the localizer at the moment, so that's fine. What we'll do is we'll reduce the vertical speed. I'll put the speed brake away, make sure it's disarmed, select the slats, bring the speed back to 180. So I could go all the way down to 170 without taking any flap, but the flaps were available from 280 knots all the way down, flap 11 certainly. So that means I can use the flaps for a little bit extra drag if I need it. Starting to capture the localizer, I'll set 251, which is the missed approach track. I see now we're on the localizer, below the glide slope. With the rate of descent I've got selected, the aircraft's predicting it'll be level at 2,500, just beyond the ESSA 75. What that tells me is it'll intercept the glide slope without flying level. It'll get to the glide slope before it gets to level off. So I can reduce the vertical speed even further, and that'll help the aircraft slow down back to that 180. The glide slope's moving at the moment. I got the slats out, I should put the ignition onto both, and I should have done the hydraulic transfer and aux as well. So, about to capture the glide slope. What I'll do is I'll select flaps 11. You notice the aircraft will balloon ever so slightly. That's not uncommon in real life as well. A320 is very prone to doing that as you select flap 2. Just watching, making sure we get glide slope mode. There we go. So localizer, glide slope, and speed's 180. I'll set 1500, ready to select that in the event of a missed approach. It's coming back to 180 quite happily. I'm surprised at how much drag flap 11 causes when there's actually not so much flap out on the wing. Gut feeling is the aircraft's maybe a little bit too slippy without flap, and maybe a little bit too draggy with flap, but that's only just a guess. It still flies really nicely. You just have to be aware of the aircraft you're flying at the time. So just passing the ESSA 7.5, 2500 was what we expected, so it looks like it's a sensible glide slope we're on. With that in mind, I'll put the gear down, select flap 15, and bring the speed back. We'll come all the way back to 150 now. We're not going to let it get there, but the speed cards say it's good enough anyway. Flap 28 and flap 40 are available from, I think it's 195 actually, but we can use them at any point should we need it. There's flap 28, we'll come back to the flap 28 speed. And get everything else done, so flap 40, 133 was the speed. We'll arm the spoilers and set the auto brake to arm. You can put the landing leg on as well. I'll leave that dim just now, it's daylight conditions. If you've flown the IXEG model, the way it takes the auto throttle out is really very clever, that you disconnect the auto throttle but it doesn't immediately jump to where your joystick is. It will momentarily hold the position it's got until you line up the levers. This model doesn't do that, so before taking the auto throttle out, have a look at the EPR setting you've got there. It's about 1.17 it'll end up as. Take the auto throttle out and reset it to 1.17. Autopilot out. And for both of those disconnects, the auto throttle and the autopilot, you do need to bind a keystroke for it, otherwise the annunciators will continue to flash all the way through. The previous time I recorded this video, I was getting about 9 frames per second by this point, and regardless of that, the touchdown was okay, but the MD-80 is a very difficult aircraft to land in the sim. There's always a chance you'll get a master caution from it, even with a very little bounce, because it's got the spoilers deployed at that point and the flaps. You get master caution from it. We'll see how we got on today. You can see the lights on the runway, the first rapid exit taxiway on the left. That's what I'm aiming for. So final check, we've got gear down, 3 greens, flap 40, landing slat. Speed, maybe a touch on the fast side according to the PFD, a little bit high as well. I'll keep following those flight directors. There we go. Notice the call-outs are very quiet. I think X-Plane 11 and the rotate model, I think it's still a little bit of a work in progress. I know X-Plane's been a moving target for the developers. Hopefully that'll improve the next release. So only using the PAPIs just now, you can see it would be calling glide slope at me, but the profile's fine. And down. So we've got spoilers, reversers. Let the auto brakes do the work initially. Below 100 knots. It's just reverse idle, obviously. Override the brakes a little bit, just tap gently on the brakes. Put the reversers away. And we'll taxi off. Excellent. So vacate the runway, do it at a nice slow speed. I'll turn off the nose lights just now. We'll turn off the ignition system, finish with the pitot heater as well, and I can have the strobes off. They should turn off automatically on the ground on the MD. Put the spoilers away, I'll use the keystrokes for that, it makes it easier. And we'll put the flaps away. Turn the radar off. And make sure the transponder is set to XPDR. With that in mind, we can start the APU. We'll try and do a single engine taxi on the way in, so APU is coming on. And because I'm going to shut down engine number 2 at one point, I will turn the number 2 pack off as well. Click those flight directors off, but they will come back on for some reason as the system resets. Don't know why it does that, but you know, it's no big deal. Here's the right hand pack off. Reasonably straight bit of taxiway just now, so let's just check what we've got. We've turned the ignition off, we've turned the pitot off, lights off, we're dim on the nose light, flight directors are off, strobes, it's back to on, which is just the nav lights, speed brake, flap slat, weather radar transponder, APU is coming up. Looks good. So it's resetting the FMS at the moment. APU is available, and this is where we could get ourselves stuck if we don't watch what we're doing. So although the APU is available, it's not allowed to connect the generator to the bus at the moment. Before we shut down the engine, we'll flick this switch here to on. That makes the generator available, but it doesn't actually connect it because the aircraft still thinks the generators on the main engine's a better source. Let's shut down number 2. And that click you hear is it transitioning onto APU gen for the right bus. See if we can find our parking spot. There we go, its flight directors are back on. We'll switch it back off again. Again, I don't know why it does that, but it's such a small thing that it shouldn't affect the enjoyment of the sim. Taxiing in single engine, obviously we want to make sure that we try and keep it moving if we can. Just double check the auto brake did actually disarm, it did, and we'll switch that back to off. This is where having 2 crew members obviously helps, because if you were actually operating this aircraft with a single pilot, let's say you had a pilot incapacitation or something like that, you would stop the aircraft somewhere safe, and then you would do the checklist, and then you would start taxiing again. You certainly wouldn't do it as you were moving, and you probably wouldn't do single engine taxi or anything else that distracts you. So this parking spot on the left looks good. I'll turn off the nose lights to avoid blinding MD that's going to marshal us onto the stand, and we'll self-position onto the stand. I want to use the air stairs, so we'll stop before the jetty. Parking brake set. So let's walk through the shutdown in a sensible manner here. To park the aircraft, we'll make sure that we've got APU avail light. Well, we've done that anyway because we single engine taxi. I want to make the left bus available as well, so that's on. Notice it hasn't swapped over, still this generator providing the left system. We'll shut down the left engine. Pack should be off first of all, obviously. Once we've done that, we can turn off the fuel pumps. I'll leave the right aft on for the APU. The other pumps will shut off. We'll turn off the electric trans and the aux electric, put the engine pumps to low. Make sure the engine's spooling down, which it is. With that in mind, we can turn off the beacon, let people outside know it's safe to approach the aircraft. We can also turn off the, set the transponder back to standby at 2000. so that air traffic can see that there's no response. So if they've got ground movement radar, they can see we're shutting down. And finally, aircraft safe. Obviously, the cabin crew would have disarmed the slides. We can turn off the seatbelt signs. So seatbelts go to off. Hopefully at this point the ground crew are plugging in the external power for us. So I'll make the GPU available. And once again, you see that as I put the APU is plugged in, external power, sorry, is plugged in. As I connect it to the bus, it doesn't actually transfer over on either side. It's just ready to accept the load now. I've got to turn the APU off to let it fall onto the external power. Similarly on this side as well. Now the APU is offload, we can turn the APU off. So that's the very same logic we did to move from the main generators to the APU, and then to move from the APU down to the external bus. We had to make sure the next stage down, if you like, was available before we took the main generator offline. Let's have a look at the outside, see if there's anything we could have done better on that. So we're on the centre line, parked slightly short of the stand. We can let them open the doors now. And once the doors are open, we'll operate the stairs as well. On the approach, a couple of little bits. Obviously, it'd be better to have the ignition system on and the hydraulic electric pumps running prior to the flap selection, but it doesn't really make much difference as long as the main hydraulic pumps are running, the engine pumps are running. It's just there's a little extra nicety. If you were to lose a hydraulic pump at a late stage, you still have the pressure throughout the landing. And I mentioned also as well that if you're not comfortable operating switches and taxi the aircraft, then don't do it. Just find somewhere to stop, set the switches, and then resume the taxi again. You saw how flying a VNav profile, despite the fact it looked like initially it was all going to work out quite nicely, the very slight track shortening from air traffic or self-positioning means that you're high on the VNav profile. And that is the case in reality as well. VNav will fly a very efficient profile down towards the runway, but if there's anything that takes even 2 or 3 miles off the track distance, it gets quite difficult to get that profile back up again. Most crew like using the 3 times table because it's simple, everybody understands it, and you've got a very good understanding of your energy state. I'm going to have a look at the documentation that I've got for the MD-80, see if I can understand exactly how it does the, if it's able to do RNAV approach procedures. Gut feeling is it probably isn't in real life as it's implemented in the sim, but we can have a go at it anyway. As I said, if there's any other content you'd like to see with the MD-80 or any other suggestions at all, any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments section below. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.